For most people, Paul enters the story already fully formed. An apostle, a saint, a figure safely framed by church language and centuries of reverence. But that familiar image is too polished to be useful. Once you strip away the devotional layer, Paul looks much less like a quiet religious icon and much more like a man unusually well equipped for the role he would eventually play. Educated, mobile, relentless, capable of moving between worlds, arguing in public, winning loyalty, and pushing a fragile movement far beyond its original limits. That is what makes him so difficult to ignore. Without Paul, the movement around Jesus might have remained what it first appeared to be, a small Jewish messianic movement on the edge of the empire, intense but local, vulnerable and easy to contain. With Paul, that changed. The movement crossed language, geography, ethnicity, and law. It stopped being only a crisis inside Judea and began to take shape as something far larger. Wayne Meeks, one of the major historians of early Christianity's social world, put it memorably. Paul was a city person. The city breathes through his language. Paula Fredrickson, one of the leading historians of the early Jesus movement, makes a different but equally important point. Paul remained deeply rooted in his native Judaism. Taken together, those two observations make him much harder to simplify. He was not floating above history. He was a first-century Jew moving through the urban, political, and religious pressure of the Roman world. So the real question is not whether Paul was important. That part is obvious. The real question is whether he was important in a way that still makes people uncomfortable. Was he simply a faithful servant of Jesus, carrying the message outward as it had already been given? Or was he the man who took a movement born in the soil of Judea and refashioned it for the roads, courts, and cities of the Roman Empire? Because once you start looking at Paul historically, one possibility becomes very hard to dismiss. After Jesus himself, no one may have done more to shape the fate of Christianity than Paul. Before Paul became Paul, he was Saul of Tarsus, and that matters more than people usually realize. The man who would later carry the Jesus movement across the empire did not come out of nowhere. He was not a simple village believer swept into history by emotion. He entered the story already shaped by qualities that made him unusually dangerous: education, discipline, scriptural fluency, and the ability to move through more than one world at once. That is the first thing to understand about Saul. He was a Jew, deeply formed by the traditions of Israel. But he was not trapped in a narrow provincial corner. Tarsus was not an anonymous backwater. It was a real city in the Eastern Roman world. And that matters because cities make a certain kind of person. They teach movement, argument, adaptation, hierarchy, and ambition. Wayne Meeks, one of the major historians of early Christianity's social world, put it in a line that says almost everything. Paul was a city person. The city breathes through his language. Saul already belonged to a world larger than a local religious dispute. He knew how to think in terms of routes, communities, letters, authority, and reach. That made him very different from the image many people still carry around in their heads. When most viewers picture the early followers of Jesus, they imagine simple men pulled from one narrow setting into another. Saul is harder than that. He arrives with training. He knows Scripture well enough to use it as a weapon. He knows how to argue, defend a position, and press it hard. Paula Fredrickson, one of the leading historians of the early Jesus movement, stresses something modern audiences often miss. Paul lived his entire life within his native Judaism. He was not some detached religious free agent drifting between identities. He was a first-century Jew with a fierce internal logic. and that is exactly why his later transformation mattered so much. That also helps explain why Saul first appears not as a sympathizer, but as an enemy. He does not enter the story as a curious observer. He enters it as someone who sees the Jesus movement as a threat serious enough to attack. Movements that are weak, irrelevant, or harmless do not usually provoke that kind of response from men like Saul. The fact that he treated it as a problem worth crushing already suggests that he sensed something volatile inside it. This is where the historical picture sharpens. Saul was not important only because of what he became after Damascus. He was already important before Damascus, because he was exactly the kind of man who could either crush a movement or, if turned, accelerate it with terrifying force. The same traits work in both directions: intellectual discipline, zeal, mobility, argument, stamina, and the ability to commit completely. Once you see that, Saul's biography stops looking like a simple before and after moral tale. It starts looking like the formation of a man who was always going to have impact. The only question was on which side. That is why the opening stage of Paul's life matters so much historically. If Saul had been a softer man, a smaller man, or a less capable man, his later role might never have carried such weight. But the sources leave a different impression. They leave the impression of someone unusually well-equipped for conflict, unusually well-equipped for persuasion, and unusually well-equipped to survive in a world where religion, law, public identity, and power were tangled together at every level. So before we even reach Damascus, one thing is already becoming clear. Paul did not begin as a blank page. He began as a man of structure, intensity, and formation. That is precisely what makes the next turn so explosive. When a man like that changes sides, history does not merely gain another convert, it gains a force. The turning point in Paul's life is told so often that people stop hearing how strange it really is. A man who begins as an enemy of the Jesus movement suddenly becomes one of its most relentless advocates. That is the familiar version. Historically, though, the real problem is not whether the Damascus event mattered. The problem is how to describe what it actually was. Once you leave church language behind, the word conversion becomes less simple than it sounds. E.P. Sanders, one of the most influential scholars of Paul in the last century, argued that Paul's Damascus experience should not be imagined as a neat conversion from one religion to another. In Sanders's formulation, there was not first a conversion and then a call. There was a call to the work among the Gentiles. That changes the whole angle of the story. Paul was not moving from Judaism to Christianity, as if those were already two finished religions standing side by side. He was a first-century Jew who came to believe that the crucified Jesus had been revealed as Messiah, and that this revelation had given him a mission. That is why the Damascus Road matters historically. Not because historians can reconstruct every sensory detail of what happened. They cannot. They cannot step into the event and verify a heavenly voice the way they verify an inscription. But they can see the result with unusual clarity. After Damascus, Paul does not merely soften his position. He does not become vaguely sympathetic. He redirects his entire life. His energy, his training, his scriptural imagination, and his sense of urgency all move into a new channel. From that point forward, he behaves like a man under commission, not like a man who has simply adopted a fresh opinion. Paula Fredrickson, one of the major historians of early Christianity, makes the same correction from another angle. She says bluntly that Paul was not converting from Judaism to something else. He was joining a Jewish group within Judaism. That distinction matters. It means Damascus was not, in historical terms, a clean break from Paul's native world. It was a violent rereading of that world from the inside. The God of Israel remained the same God. The scriptures remained Israel's scriptures. What changed was Paul's conviction that the age had shifted, that Jesus had been vindicated and that the nations now had to be brought in before the end. That makes the event far more explosive than the softer religious version many people carry around. If Damascus is not just private inspiration, then it is the moment when a highly trained, deeply committed opponent becomes convinced that history itself has turned. Once a man like that believes he has been given a task, he is no longer just another believer. He becomes a force multiplier. The same intensity that once made him dangerous to the Jesus movement now makes him dangerous for the world around it. This is why Damascus matters so much in any historical reconstruction of Paul. It is not simply the story of a sinner becoming religious. It is the story of a man of structure, argument, and zeal being redirected into a mission large enough to outgrow Judea. That is why the chapters that follow make sense. The travel, the conflict, the letters, the pressure on communities, the refusal to stay small. All of it begins to look less like improvisation and more like the unfolding of a calling Paul believed had been placed on him with absolute force. So the deeper question is not just what Paul saw on the road. The deeper question is what that experience turned him into. After Damascus, Paul is no longer simply Saul the pursuer. He becomes the man who will force the Jesus movement to decide whether it belongs only to Israel or whether it is about to move out into the nations. This is the point where Paul stops looking like a converted believer and starts looking like a historical threat. Because once he begins preaching, he does not simply step into the Jesus movement and quietly take his place inside it. He runs straight into its center. And that center is not Rome. It is Jerusalem. That matters because Jerusalem is where the original authority still lives. Peter is there. James, the brother of Jesus, is there. The movement is still close enough to its source that the question is no longer theoretical. It becomes brutally practical. What is this movement now? Is it still a Jewish messianic movement shaped by Israel's covenant and Israel's law? Or is it becoming something larger and far more unstable? A movement that can take in Gentiles without requiring them to become Jews first. That is why Galatians matters so much. Paul does not write that letter like a man calmly recalling an old disagreement. He writes like someone fighting over the truth of the movement itself. James D.G. Dunn, one of the most important New Testament historians of the last century, described Peter as a kind of bridge man between Paul and James, and treated the clash at Antioch as evidence of real conflict inside the earliest Jesus movement. That matters because it means the tension is not a later invention. It is already visible in the earliest material. And nowhere is it clearer than Antioch. Paul says that when Peter came there, he opposed him to his face. Before certain men arrived from James, Peter had been eating with Gentiles. Then he pulled back. That single scene says more than pages of later commentary. This was not a polite theological exchange. It was a fight over belonging, over shared meals, shared identity, and whether Gentile believers could be fully inside the movement without passing through the old boundary lines of Jewish law. N.T. Wright puts it sharply. The issue was who was allowed to sit at the same table. In other words, the future of the Jesus movement was being fought out through bodies, meals, and boundaries. That is what makes this episode so important historically. People often imagine the earliest followers of Jesus as if they already agreed on what his message meant, and Paul simply helped carry it farther. But the sources show something much more difficult and much more human. They show leaders under pressure, trying to hold together a movement that was growing faster than its original categories could contain. Jerusalem stood for continuity, memory, and the original shape of the movement. Paul stood for expansion, urgency, and a future that could no longer be kept inside Judea alone. Paula Fredrickson, one of the leading historians of early Christianity, reads this conflict inside Judaism, not outside it. That is an important correction. At this stage, the fight is not Christianity versus Judaism. It is a Jewish argument about how the God of Israel is now acting and what that means for the nations. And that actually makes the conflict more intense, not less. The people involved share the same scriptures, the same God, and the same symbolic world. They are not arguing as outsiders. They are struggling inside the same house. This is where Paul becomes truly dangerous. He is no longer just preaching Christ. He is forcing the movement to decide what it will become. Will it remain a renewal movement inside Judaism, still marked by the old boundary lines? Or will it become something in which Gentiles can enter directly through Christ, without first passing through the full structure of Jewish identity and law? That is the hinge. So when Paul confronts Peter, with James standing behind the tension in the background, we are not watching a minor quarrel among pious men. We are watching the future of Christianity being argued out in real time. And that is why Paul matters so much historically. He did not simply spread a message. He stepped into the struggle over who had the authority to define what that message would become. If Jerusalem was the center of memory, Paul was becoming something else entirely. He was becoming the architect of expansion. And the main tool he used was not a pulpit, not an office, not a temple, and not even his physical presence. It was the letter. That matters because people hear the word epistle and imagine something soft, private reflections, spiritual advice, a holy man sending encouragement from far away. But Paul's letters do not read like that. They read like intervention. They are tense, strategic, corrective, and often written into the middle of a crisis. He is not writing because everything is stable. He is writing because communities are already drifting, splitting, misreading him, fighting, collapsing into scandal, or testing the limits of his authority. So the letters are not side material. They are evidence that Paul was trying to govern something from a distance. That is one reason historians take them so seriously. Wayne Meeks, one of the most important historians of the social world of early Christianity, argued that Pauline communities were real urban social bodies, shaped by status, household structure, patronage, and the pressure of city life. That is a crucial correction, because once you see those communities that way, Paul's letters stop looking like floating theology. They start looking like tools designed to hold unstable groups together inside a difficult social world. And Paul uses those tools with force. He argues, warns, pleads, rebukes, reasserts his authority, names people, pushes back against rival teachers, and tries to stop fractures before they harden into permanent division. This is not the behavior of a passive saint sending pious thoughts into the air. It is the behavior of a man trying to keep a movement from tearing itself apart. That is where Paul starts to look much more formidable than the devotional image most people carry in their heads. Because he is not just preaching Christ in one place and moving on. He is building continuity across geography. He is teaching separate groups in different cities to think of themselves as part of one expanding reality. He is creating lines of correction, memory, loyalty, and discipline that continue to function even when he is absent. And that may be one of the most important strategic facts about him. Paul is building something that can survive his absence. John Barclay, one of the major modern scholars of Paul, stresses that Paul's thinking is always tied to concrete communities and concrete pressures, not detached from them. That matters because it reminds us that the letters were not written for libraries. They were written to intervene in living situations. Paul is not producing abstract doctrine for the future. He is trying to stabilize a movement in real time. Once you see that, the scale of what he was doing becomes much clearer. A local preacher can inspire one group and disappear. Paul was doing something more durable. He was training communities to remain linked across distance. He was pushing them to adopt a shared language, a shared identity, and a shared sense of belonging to something bigger than their city. At that point, Christianity stops looking like a local disturbance and starts looking like a network. And that is why the letters matter so much historically. They preserve theology, yes, and they are early. But more than that, they let us watch a movement being managed while it is still unstable. You can feel the pressure inside them. The communities are not calm. Authority is contested. Identity is fragile. Nothing is settled. Paul is stepping into that instability again and again, trying to force coherence out of chaos. So, if we want to understand why the Jesus movement did not simply vanish after the first generation, Paul's letters are works that connected the Eastern Roman world. That mobility changed everything. Ideas do not change the world just by existing. They change the world when somebody knows how to carry them through real space. Paul knew how to do that. He knew how to enter a city, gather people, speak in the right places, form a core group, move on, and still keep influence after he was gone. He knew how to work with distance rather than be defeated by it. He knew how to use the infrastructure of empire without belonging to the empire's power. That is one reason he looks so different from the softer, devotional image many people are used to. Historically, Paul is not a static holy man. He is a moving figure. That matters even more if the tradition about his Roman citizenship is true. Roman citizenship was not a decorative detail. It was status, protection, legal leverage, and a way of surviving in a world where power was rarely gentle. A man with that status could sometimes appeal, delay punishment, demand procedure, and move through the machinery of empire differently from an ordinary provincial subject. Whether one wants to debate every detail of how Acts presents that status, the larger historical point still stands. Paul moved through the Roman world with a level of confidence and legal awareness that made him unusually hard to crush quickly. And that becomes part of the story. Because the same man who preached Christ also knew courts, hearings, accusations, custody, and the language of rights. He was not simply drifting from one spiritual encounter to another. He was moving through a dangerous world with enough intelligence to survive inside it. That combination matters. A pure visionary burns out fast. A pure organizer never changes hearts. Paul somehow carried both impulses at once. Jerome Murphy O'Connor, one of the major historians of Paul's travels and world, treated Paul not as a vague religious wanderer, but as a concrete traveler moving through known routes, known cities, and known pressures. That is the right way to see him. Paul's life was not floating above geography. It was tied to roads, sea passages, delays, local politics, patronage, and the daily reality of how one actually moved through the Roman East. And once you see that, prison starts to look different too. Because imprisonment did not silence Paul the way we might expect. Again and again, confinement becomes another stage from which he continues to influence people. He writes from custody. He remains mentally active under pressure. He turns restriction into another point of contact. A weaker figure disappears under that weight. Paul keeps working. That tells you something about the scale of the man. He was not just passionate. Plenty of people are passionate. He was operational. He could function under strain. He could adapt. He could keep pressure on communities even when he was cut off from them physically. That is not just piety. That is resilience of a very high order. And this is where the image of Paul becomes much sharper. He is not only the theologian of grace, not only the convert on the Damascus road, and not only the controversial apostle fighting with Jerusalem. He is also a man who understood movement. Through geography, through law, through crisis, through the social machinery of empire. He knew how to survive long enough, travel far enough, and stay connected strongly enough to leave marks in city after city. That is one of the reasons his role became so decisive. Christianity did not spread through inspiration alone. It spread through roads, letters, households, ports, trials, delays, and the stubborn endurance of people who kept moving. Paul was one of the rare figures who could carry a message through all of that without losing either the message or himself. So when we picture Paul historically, we should not imagine a halo standing still. We should imagine a man in motion, crossing cities, facing charges, using every opening he could find, and turning the pathways of empire into channels for a movement that would eventually outlast the empire itself. And once that picture becomes clear, the next question follows naturally. If Paul was moving through the Roman world with that kind of reach, status, and resilience, what hard evidence do we actually have that his life belongs to real, datable history rather than to church memory alone? That is where archaeology begins to matter. At a certain point, a figure like Paul has to face the hardest historical question of all. Where does he stop being a man of religious memory and start becoming a man we can place inside real, datable history? That is where archaeology, inscriptions, and chronology start to matter. Paul is not important historically just because later Christians remembered him. He matters because parts of his life can actually be pinned against the wider framework of the Roman world. That does not make every detail suddenly certain, but it does mean he is not floating in devotional fog. He belongs to a timeline, and one of the strongest anchors in that timeline is Gallio. Gallio, a Roman senator and proconsul of Achaia, appears in Acts during Paul's time in Corinth, and the famous inscription from Delphi mentioning Gallio gives historians one of the firmest chronological fixed points in Paul's life. The inscription ties Gallio's tenure to the reign of Claudius and places it around AD 51 to 52, which means Paul's time in Corinth is no longer just a church story. It falls into the datable calendar of the empire. That may sound technical, but it matters enormously. Once a figure can be locked to a real magistrate, a real province, and a real imperial time frame, the whole atmosphere changes. Paul is no longer just a voice in letters. He is a man standing in front of Roman administration at a moment we can place with unusual confidence. That is rare. Ancient lives often remain blurred at the edges. Paul, at least at this point, steps into focus. And that changes the way we read him. His journeys, his imprisonments, his letters, and his conflicts are not happening in some abstract sacred timeline. They are happening inside the machinery of the first-century Roman world. Governors, provinces, hearings, urban assemblies, imperial dates, all of that begins to press in. Christianity stops looking like a legend growing in soft, symbolic time, and starts looking like a movement, moving through the same calendar, roads, and legal structures as everything else in the empire. That is why the Gallio inscription matters so much. Not because it proves every word of Acts in a simplistic way, but because it ties the Pauline world to external history. Britannica notes that the Gallio inscription at Delphi provides the date for Gallio as proconsul of Achaia when Paul was at Corinth, and places Gallio's term around 51 to 52. That is exactly the kind of thing historians pay attention to, because it gives them a fixed point from which other parts of Paul's life can be arranged. And once one fixed point is secure, everything around it begins to feel heavier. Paul's presence in Corinth becomes more concrete. The letters connected to that phase become easier to locate. His wider route through the eastern Mediterranean stops feeling like a sacred blur and starts resembling a life moving through real cities under real pressure. The Roman world is no longer just the backdrop to Paul. It becomes the frame that helps us date him. That is the real power of archaeology in a story like this. It does not replace the texts, it tests their world. It gives edges to what might otherwise stay vague. So when people ask whether Paul belongs to history or only to faith, the answer is that he belongs to both, in different ways. But on the historical side, he is not suspended in mist. He is tied to places, names, offices, and dates that the wider Roman world itself helps confirm. The Gallio inscription is one of the clearest examples of that. It is a reminder that Paul's life intersects not only with theology and church memory, but with the hard administrative spine of empire. And that changes the scale of the whole discussion. Because once Paul is fixed that firmly inside history, the next question becomes much harder to avoid. If this man is so deeply anchored in the real world of the empire, was he simply carrying the message of Jesus farther than anyone else? Or was he reshaping that message as he carried it? That is where the argument becomes even more serious. This is the point where the argument around Paul becomes impossible to keep comfortable. Because once you see how far he traveled, how hard he fought, how aggressively he wrote, and how deeply he shaped communities across the Roman world, a larger question starts to press in. Was Paul simply carrying the message of Jesus farther than anyone else? Or was he also changing its scale, its language, and perhaps even its center of gravity as he carried it? That question has never gone away, and it is not a fringe question. It is one of the central tensions in the historical study of Paul. Some writers pose it crudely and say Paul invented Christianity. That version is too simple to be good history. But the weaker version of the same question remains serious. Did Paul, in the act of extending the movement, also redefine what it would become? That is much harder to dismiss. By the time you get to Paul's letters, several things are already clear. The movement is no longer speaking only within the small frame of Judea. It is speaking in Greek across cities. It is dealing with Gentiles directly. It is forming communities that are not structured around the old boundaries in quite the same way. And the death and resurrection of Jesus are no longer being handled only as events inside Israel's story. They are being preached as world-changing realities for the nations. That is not a minor adjustment. It is a transformation in scale. James D.G. Dunn, one of the most important historians of Paul in the last century, pushed back hard against the crude idea that Paul simply invented a new religion. He explicitly called Chaim Maccobee's The Mythmaker, Paul and the Invention of Christianity, a regrettable reversion to older polemics. In other words, the cheap version of Paul created Christianity is not where serious history lands. But Dunn's own work still makes clear why the question survives. Paul was not peripheral. He was one of the decisive agents through whom the movement took on a recognizably new historical form. That is the balance we have to keep. Paul did not create Jesus, invent the crucifixion, or produce the earliest faith from nothing. But he did something else, and historically it may be just as important. He took a movement born in the soil of Jewish expectation and drove it into the arteries of the Roman world. He gave it language that could travel. He argued for a form of belonging that did not require Gentiles to pass fully through Jewish law. He linked scattered communities into something larger than local memory. He made the movement think at the scale of cities, routes, correspondence, and nations. Once that happens, the movement does not remain what it was before. Paula Fredrickson, one of the leading historians of early Christianity, insists that Paul remained a Jew and thought from within Judaism. That is a necessary correction because it stops us from turning him into a detached, religious entrepreneur floating free from his roots. But that same correction sharpens the historical problem rather than softening it. If Paul stayed inside Judaism while arguing that the nations could now enter directly through Christ, then the scale of the shift becomes even more striking. The transformation did not come from someone outside the tradition smashing it. It came from someone inside it, forcing it into a future many had not imagined. That is why Paul still divides people so strongly. To some, he is the faithful apostle who understood the implications of Jesus more clearly than others did. To others, he is the man who pushed the movement so far outward that it became something the first community would barely have recognized. History does not resolve that tension cleanly. But it does make one thing very hard to deny. After Paul, the movement looks different. It is more geographically expansive, more intellectually articulated, more flexible in relation to Gentiles, more capable of surviving outside Judea, and more dangerous to the old limits that once contained it. That is why this question matters so much. Not because Paul invented Christianity is a serious slogan. It is not. But because the historical evidence forces a more disciplined and more unsettling version of that debate. Paul did not appear at the edge of the story. He appeared at the hinge. He took part in the moment when the movement around Jesus passed beyond its first form and became something much harder for the ancient world to contain. So the real question is not whether Paul mattered. By now, that is obvious. The real question is whether the Christianity that entered the wider Roman world would have looked remotely the same without him. And once that question is asked honestly, the final chapter almost writes itself. Paul does not irritate people by accident. He irritates them because he stands too close to the place where history changes shape. Few figures in Christian history provoke as much friction as Paul. That is not a modern invention. It is part of his legacy. One historian's summary puts it bluntly. Few figures in Western history have caused more dissension, misunderstanding, and hostility than Paul. And the reason is not hard to see. Paul refuses to stay in one category. For believers, he is the apostle who carried the message of Jesus into the wider world. For critics, he is often the man who changed that message so radically that Christianity after him no longer looks like the movement before him. For historians, he is harder still. Too Jewish to be treated as a clean break from Judaism, too expansive to be reduced to a local sectarian preacher, and too historically effective to be dismissed as a secondary figure. That combination makes him impossible to handle comfortably. The old lazy version of the argument says Paul either founded Christianity or simply repeated what had already been settled. Neither position really works. Even scholars who reject the crude slogan that Paul invented Christianity still admit that after Paul, the movement looks different. More mobile, more urban, more legible to Gentiles, and more tightly connected by letters and communities spread across cities. And even scholars who stress Paul's continuity with Judaism insist that his mission changed the scale of the movement in ways that cannot be ignored. Paula Fredrikson's line that Paul lived his life entirely within his native Judaism is meant as a correction to simplistic accounts, but it actually sharpens the problem rather than softening it. If someone so deeply rooted in Judaism could still force the Jesus movement outward into the nations, then the transformation came from inside the house, not from outside it. That is one reason Paul still divides readers so sharply. He frustrates people who want a pure, untouched continuity from Jesus to later Christianity. He also frustrates people who want an easy story, in which Christianity is simply a betrayal engineered by one ambitious mind. The sources will not let either side have an easy victory. Paul is too anchored in the earliest movement to be treated as an outsider who hijacked it from nowhere. But he is also too effective, too forceful, and too historically consequential to be reduced to a minor messenger carrying someone else's finished system. And that is why he keeps coming back as a problem. Paul stands too close to the place where Christianity changed scale. That is the real source of the irritation. Once you remove the devotional haze and the anti-Christian caricatures, he is left standing in a very awkward position. Not at the origin of the movement, but dangerously close to the point where its future took on a form the Roman world could no longer ignore. So by the end of his story, the question is no longer whether Paul mattered. It is whether Christianity, as history actually came to know it, would look remotely the same without him. That is the question that leads straight into the conclusion.